After my husband died, his billionaire employer called me and whispered, "I found something Daniel hid. Come to my office now." Then his voice became even quieter. "Don't tell your daughter. Don't tell your son-in-law. If they learn you're coming, you may not survive the night." I thought grief had finally pushed the old man's mind beyond reason. But when I stepped through the front door of his mansion less than an hour later, I stopped breathing. Standing beside him wasn't a lawyer or a family friend. It was a gray-haired man wearing an old FBI windbreaker holding a folder with my husband's name printed across the front in thick black letters. Then he looked directly into my eyes and said the words that shattered everything I believed about the man I had loved for 43 years, "Mrs. Collins. I don't think your husband died of natural causes. My name is Margaret Collins. I turned 67 2 months before Daniel passed away, though birthdays had stopped meaning much after retirement. Daniel used to tease me every year by buying the smallest birthday cake he could find, claiming the calories didn't count if the cake looked lonely. We would sit on the back porch with 2 forks, eating directly from the box while the neighborhood settled into evening. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. The morning we buried him, the sky hung low over Cedar Ridge Cemetery. Gray clouds drifted across the hills as though the heavens themselves had grown too tired to stand upright. A cold breeze carried the scent of damp grass and fresh earth. I stood beside the casket with both hands wrapped around a single white rose, trying to memorize the last place my husband would ever rest. Daniel Collins had spent 28 years working as estate manager for Charles Whitmore, one of the wealthiest men in Pennsylvania. Most people assumed he was little more than a caretaker for a sprawling mansion. They never understood what Charles always said whenever anyone asked about Daniel: "I don't trust my money, I trust Daniel." My husband never repeated those words. He wasn't the kind of man who collected compliments. He believed a person's reputation should speak before they entered a room and remained behind after they left. Friends from church filled the first several rows. Former employees from Whitmore Estate stood quietly along the back wall of the chapel, many of them wiping tears from their faces. Several came to hug me afterward, telling stories about Daniel fixing broken fences, driving stranded workers home during snowstorms, or quietly paying medical bills for families who never learned where the money had come from. Everyone seemed to understand what we had lost. Everyone except my daughter Emily, who arrived almost 35 minutes after the service had begun. The heavy chapel doors creaked open, drawing dozens of silent glances. She hurried inside wearing an expensive black designer coat that looked more appropriate for a fashion magazine than a funeral. Ryan followed behind her, adjusting the cuffs of a navy suit that still carried its department store crease. Neither of them looked toward Daniel's casket. Instead, Ryan checked his watch. Emily leaned close to him. They whispered. He nodded, and then both sat down without a word to me. I told myself not to judge them too quickly. People carried grief differently. Perhaps they had argued during the drive. Perhaps traffic had delayed them. But as Pastor Mitchell spoke about Daniel's kindness and quiet strength, Ryan glanced at his phone no fewer than 6 times. Emily folded and unfolded the funeral program until the paper softened beneath her fingers. Their faces carried impatience rather than sorrow. When the service ended, neighbors gathered around me with embraces and warm memories. Emily finally approached. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she said, kissing my cheek. I wanted desperately to believe her. Then she asked her second question. "Did Dad ever tell you where he kept the office keys?" I stared at her. "What?" Ryan answered before she could. "The keys. The ones for his files. Charles Whitmore probably needs everything organized." My husband had been buried for less than 10 minutes. Ryan offered an awkward smile. "We're just trying to help." Daniel used to say that greed rarely arrived, shouting. It entered quietly, dressed as concern. We drove to the church fellowship hall afterward. Volunteers had prepared sandwiches, coffee, and homemade pies. Daniel loved peach pie. Mrs. Henderson placed one on the serving table because she said funerals should honor the living as much as the dead. Emily barely touched her food. Ryan wandered through conversations while pretending to be polite, but I noticed him studying everyone from Whitmore Estate. Every time one of Charles's senior employees entered the room, Ryan casually drifted closer, listening, watching, measuring. Late that afternoon, after the final guest had left, I returned home exhausted. The silence inside the house felt unnatural. Daniel's reading glasses still rested beside his recliner. His favorite coffee mug remained in the drying rack. His jacket hung by the back door exactly where he'd left it. I reached for it before remembering no one would wear it again. The phone rang. The caller ID simply read Charles Whitmore. I answered immediately. His normally commanding voice sounded thin. "Margaret." "Yes, Charles. I need you to come here today." "Charles, today isn't—" "I know exactly what today is," he paused. "I found something Daniel left inside my private office." My heart skipped. "What kind of something?" I can't explain over the phone. Another silence, longer this time. Then he spoke so softly I almost missed the words, "Don't tell Emily." The room suddenly felt colder. "What?" "And don't tell Ryan, Margaret. Because if either of them knows you're coming," his breathing became uneven, "you could be in serious danger." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Every instinct told me this conversation made no sense. Emily might be careless, Ryan might be arrogant but dangerous, impossible. Yet something inside Charles's voice reached through the telephone line. It wasn't panic, it was certainty. "I'll come," I finally whispered. "Use the west entrance. The service entrance." "Yes. I'll have someone waiting." 40 minutes later, my aging Subaru climbed the winding road toward Whitmore Estate. The enormous iron gates opened before I even reached them. Someone had been watching. The mansion looked exactly as I remembered from the Christmas parties Daniel occasionally convinced me to attend. White stone columns, perfect gardens, windows glowing against the approaching night. But tonight none of it felt welcoming. A man opened the side entrance before I knocked. He wore a dark suit instead of a butler's uniform. He never smiled. "This way, Mrs. Collins." The hallway seemed unusually quiet. No housekeepers, no security guards, no voices, only the sound of my footsteps against polished marble. When we reached Charles's private study, the door slowly opened. Charles Whitmore sat behind his desk, looking older than I had ever seen him. Beside him stood a tall, gray-haired man wearing a faded FBI windbreaker over civilian clothes. A thick case file rested beneath his arm. Across the tab, printed in bold black letters, were two words, "Daniel Collins." The stranger looked at me with tired eyes. Then he spoke. "Mrs. Collins, I've spent 32 years investigating financial crimes." He placed the file gently onto Charles's desk. "And I believe your husband died because he discovered something someone was willing to kill for." For several long seconds I couldn't move. The room seemed to shrink around me while those words echoed in my ears. "I believe your husband died because he discovered something someone was willing to kill for." "No," I whispered automatically. "Daniel had a heart attack." The gray-haired man didn't argue. Instead, he slowly removed his glasses and folded them with the deliberate movements of someone who had spent decades delivering terrible news. "My name is Thomas Mercer," he said. "I retired from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division 6 years ago." He nodded toward Charles Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore hired me 3 months ago." I looked at Charles. "You hired an FBI investigator while Daniel was still alive?" Charles lowered his eyes. "No," his voice cracked. "Daniel hired him." That answer hit me harder than the first. Daniel had never hidden anything important from me, at least. That was what I had believed. Charles gestured toward an armchair beside the fireplace. "Please sit, Margaret." My knees suddenly felt unreliable. I lowered myself into the leather chair while Mercer placed the thick file onto the mahogany coffee table between us. The cover contained only one sentence. Times, "Confidential investigation, Daniel Collins." Charles leaned forward in his wheelchair. "You knew Daniel as a husband. I knew him as the only man I trusted with my entire life." His pale blue eyes drifted toward the rain beginning to strike the tall windows. "For almost 30 years, Daniel managed every property I owned. He handled payroll, he supervised renovations, he reviewed insurance, he signed contracts, he even had authority to move funds between operating accounts." I nodded. I knew all of that. Daniel often joked that he spent more time arguing with plumbers than billionaires. "He never once stole a dollar," Charles continued. "Not one." What he did discover, Mercer quietly opened the file and slid several photographs across the table, was that someone else had. The pictures showed stacks of invoices, wire transfers, bank statements, and copies of canceled checks. Most carried handwritten notes in Daniel's careful printing times, transfer repeated. Signature inconsistent. Verify account. Review immediately. I recognized his handwriting instantly. Every Christmas card, every grocery list, every anniversary note, the same neat letters. My fingertips trembled as I touched the corner of one page. "When did this start?" I asked. Mercer answered, "About 8 months ago." Charles closed his eyes. I asked Daniel why maintenance expenses suddenly doubled. He told me he'd look into it. I assumed he'd find accounting mistakes. He found something much worse. Mercer reached for another folder. The theft wasn't random. It was systematic. Someone had been draining money from trust accounts, maintenance budgets, and charitable foundations for years. Small amounts never enough to trigger automatic audits, always hidden among legitimate expenses. Millions disappeared, one careful transfer at a time. I stared at him. Did Daniel know who it was? Mercer hesitated. He had strong suspicions, but he refused to accuse anyone without proof. That sounded exactly like my husband. Daniel never judged before gathering facts. Charles reached beneath his desk and produced a small black notebook. "I found this yesterday." He pushed it toward me. Daniel's initials were embossed on the cover. Inside, every page contained dates, transactions, observations, names, and questions. No dramatic conclusions, just evidence. Always evidence. One page caught my attention times. If anything happens to me, continue checking account 7,841. Trust, no verbal explanations. Follow the documents. A chill crawled slowly across my shoulders. I looked up. When did he write this? Mercer answered quietly. About 3 weeks before he died. The room fell silent. Outside thunder rolled across the hills. Charles reached for a glass of water. His hand shook badly enough that I stood and poured it for him. He smiled sadly. Daniel always did that. I couldn't answer. Mercer removed another envelope. There is something else. He spread several color photographs across the table. Security camera images. Our house. My house. Taken from outside. I leaned closer. The timestamps showed different nights, different weeks. Someone had photographed our front porch, Daniel's truck, his office window, our mailbox. Why, I whispered. Mercer slid another picture toward me. This camera belongs to a neighboring property. The photograph showed a figure standing near our garage after midnight. The image was grainy and dark. A hood covered most of the face, but one thing remained visible: the person carried a key. A house key, I asked. Mercer nodded. Whoever entered already had access. No sign of forced entry. No broken windows. No alarms triggered. They walked in. Charles slowly rubbed his forehead. Daniel told me someone had been inside his office. He thought papers had been moved, but nothing was stolen. Mercer added quietly, not yet. He opened another evidence envelope. Inside were photographs of file drawers, folders, and desk surfaces. Everything looked ordinary until he pointed. Look carefully. At first I saw nothing. Then I noticed it. Daniel always aligned every folder perfectly square. These weren't. One drawer had been pushed back, slightly crooked. Another file sat upside down. Tiny details, the sort only my husband would notice. He told me I was imagining it, I murmured. Both men looked at me. I swallowed. 2 weeks before he died, he came downstairs after midnight. He asked whether I'd gone into his office. I told him no. He checked every drawer and he finally laughed and said maybe he'd become forgetful. Tears blurred my vision. He wasn't forgetful. Mercer slowly shook his head. No. He was being watched. Charles reached toward another stack of documents. I should have insisted he stop. He refused. He kept saying, Charles smiled sadly, if someone honest walks away, only dishonest people remain. That was Daniel always believing. Responsibility mattered more than comfort. Mercer closed the file for a moment. Mrs. Collins, there is one last thing you need to see tonight. He removed a transparent evidence sleeve. Inside lay a fingerprint report. Several names had already been identified. Daniel Me cleaning staff, Charles employees. Then one final print remained highlighted in yellow times, unknown family match. I frowned. What does that mean? Mercer met my eyes. It means the unidentified fingerprint belongs to one of your immediate family members. The words barely registered. No, we compared every employee, every contractor, every visitor. The remaining print belongs to someone genetically related to the Collins family. I stared at the report. The paper suddenly felt impossibly heavy. My daughter Mercer didn't answer. My grandchildren, still nothing. Finally, I whispered, the only name left, Ryan. Mercer folded his hands. We don't know. Not yet. But whoever left that fingerprint entered Daniel's office only 4 days before his death. Charles slowly closed the notebook. The fire crackled softly behind him and rain continued tapping against the tall windows. Everything in the room felt unbearably still. Then Mercer reached into the case one final time. He removed a small digital voice recorder. There are 23 recordings. Daniel made them over the final month of his life. He placed it gently in front of me. You should prepare yourself. The first one begins with these words. Mercer pressed the play button. Static filled the room and then my husband's calm, unmistakable voice emerged from the tiny speaker times. If you're hearing this, I've already run out of time. If you're hearing this, I've already run out of time. Daniel's voice filled Charles Whitmore's study with the same calm steadiness I had heard every morning for more than 4 decades. My heart clenched so tightly I had to grip the edge of the chair. I hope I'm wrong, Times, he continued. I pray I'm wrong. But if something happens to me before I finish this investigation, don't trust appearances, trust evidence. The recording ended with a soft click. No dramatic farewell, no tears, just Daniel being Daniel. Methodical until the very end. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Mercer reached over and switched off the recorder. There are 22 more recordings, he said quietly. I don't recommend listening to them all tonight. I nodded. My mind was already overflowing. Charles folded his hands across the blanket covering his legs. Go home, his voice carried the gentle authority that had once managed thousands of employees. Act as though nothing happened. If Daniel suspected someone close to you. He stopped himself. They'll be watching. Mercer slid a business card toward me. My personal number. No office, no voicemail. If anything feels wrong, even something small, you call me. I tucked the card into my purse beside Daniel's notebook. As I stood to leave, Charles called my name one more time. Margaret. I turned. Daniel trusted your instinct. You should too. The drive home felt longer than before. Rain streaked across the windshield while the wipers pushed it aside in slow, rhythmic sweeps. Every passing set of headlights made me glance into the rearview mirror. Twice I thought someone was following me. Twice they turned off before I reached town. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the porch light was already on. Emily stood waiting beneath it, and relief washed across her face the moment she saw my car. There you are, she hurried toward me before I had even turned off the engine. I've been worried sick. Her hug felt genuine warm. For one dangerous second, I almost believed everything Mercer had told me was impossible. My phone died, I said. I should have called. Ryan stepped out behind her carrying 2 grocery bags. We brought dinner, his smile looked perfectly natural. Thought you shouldn't spend your first night alone. I thanked them and unlocked the front door. The familiar smell of cinnamon candles and old books greeted me. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, the house didn't feel completely empty. Emily heated soup while Ryan set the table. They moved through the kitchen with surprising ease, almost as if they had been here recently. I caught myself times. Stop. Don't invent suspicion. Daniel would have looked for proof, not feelings. Dinner remained strangely pleasant. Emily told stories about work. Ryan complained about highway construction. Neither mentioned money. Neither asked about Charles Whitmore. Neither asked where I had gone. If I hadn't heard those recordings, I might have considered the evening perfectly ordinary. After we finished eating, Emily reached for my hand. Mom, you don't have to stay here alone. I looked at her. You could move in with us. Ryan nodded immediately. It would only be temporary until things settle down. I appreciate that, I replied. But I'm staying here. Emily's smile barely changed. Are you sure? This house is awfully big and Dad handled everything. You shouldn't have to worry about repairs or bills. Before I could answer, Ryan spoke again. I actually know a great realtor. The sentence landed softly, too softly. I remembered the funeral, the office keys, and now the house. Always one step closer. I'll think about it, I said. That seemed to satisfy them. Around 9 o'clock, they finally left. Emily hugged me tightly. Ryan squeezed my shoulder. Call any time. Their taillights disappeared down the street. Only then did I lock every door. I didn't sleep. Instead, I carried Daniel's notebook into his office. Nothing looked unusual. His desk remained perfectly organized, pens, aligned folders, stacked calendar, still open to the week he died. Yet after everything Mercer had shown me, the room no longer felt untouched. I opened the top drawer, nothing. Second drawer, receipts. Third drawer, insurance policies. Then something caught my attention, a tiny scratch near the brass lock. Fresh. Daniel polished that desk every Sunday morning. He would have noticed. I slowly closed the drawer. Someone really had been here. The next morning I decided to test something. Nothing dramatic, just one small lie. I called Emily. I found an old envelope in your father's desk. Silence then. Immediate interest. What kind of envelope? I'm not sure. It mentions a safety deposit box. Another pause. I'll come after work. No hurry, I replied. There probably isn't anything important. We hung up. I never found an envelope. There wasn't one. By noon, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Charles, his voice sounding sharper than the night before. Did you tell anyone about a safety deposit box? My pulse jumped. No, not exactly. What happened? Our bank manager called. He said someone phoned asking whether Daniel Collins maintained any active deposit boxes. I gripped the kitchen counter. Who called? They wouldn't tell him, but they asked 3 specific questions: location, contents, and whether the surviving spouse had already gained access. I slowly closed my eyes. Only Emily knew about my imaginary envelope. Only Emily, unless Ryan. I thanked Charles and ended the call. Then I wrote one sentence in Daniel's notebook times lie number 1 confirmed. Information travels immediately. Over the next 3 days, I continued quietly watching, not spying, watching. Emily suddenly began dropping by almost every afternoon, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with flowers, always cheerful, always asking innocent questions. Have you looked through Dad's paperwork? Did Charles call again? Any news about insurance? Ryan became even more helpful. He replaced a broken porch light, he mowed the lawn, he insisted on checking the furnace before winter. To anyone else, they would have looked like a devoted family, but little things no longer fit together. One afternoon I found my bedroom closet slightly open. I always closed it completely. Another morning my filing cabinet wasn't locked. I always locked it. The following evening my laptop asked for my password. Someone had tried entering the wrong one 5 times. I sat staring at the screen, not frightened, thinking someone was searching systematically, just like Daniel had described. That Friday, Mercer called. We found Ryan's financial records. My stomach tightened. They're worse than expected. How bad? He owes over $400,000. I nearly dropped the phone. What? Gambling, private lenders, credit cards, personal loans. He hasn't made a full payment in almost a year. Everything suddenly made terrible sense. The expensive suits, the nervous glances, the obsession with money. Mercer continued. We also learned something else. Ryan had recently met several times with a man already under federal investigation for investment fraud. My fingers tightened around the receiver. Does Emily know? We honestly don't think so. That answer hurt more than I expected because it left open a possibility I desperately wanted to believe. Maybe my daughter wasn't leading this. Maybe she was simply following the wrong man. Mercer hesitated. There is one more development. We recovered hidden security footage. My heartbeat quickened. From where? Inside Daniel's office. I stopped breathing. There was a camera. Mercer's voice grew quieter. Not exactly. Your husband installed it himself. And Margaret, the final recording was made the night before he died. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Daniel's voice repeating the same sentence times. If you're hearing this, I've already run out of time. At 9 o'clock the following morning, I drove back to Whitmore Estate. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the long stone driveway shining beneath a pale autumn sun. The mansion looked almost peaceful, but I no longer believed beautiful places were necessarily safe. Charles Whitmore was waiting in his study. Thomas Mercer stood beside an older television connected to a digital recorder. No one greeted me with small talk. Mercer simply held up a flash drive. We recovered everything from the hidden camera. I frowned. I thought Daniel installed it. He did, but he concealed it inside the smoke detector above his office bookshelf. Mercer pointed toward the screen. It only activated when someone entered the room. Charles folded his hands. Sit down, Margaret. I lowered myself into the same leather chair as before. Mercer pressed play. The screen flickered and the first recording appeared. Daniel walked into his office carrying 2 coffee mugs. One was his familiar blue mug with the chipped handle. The other was mine. He smiled toward the camera. I finally figured out how to make this thing work, he said with a quiet laugh. For a moment, tears blurred my vision. There he was, alive, relaxed, completely unaware that I was watching him after his death. The recording skipped ahead several days. Daniel sat alone at his desk sorting folders. Every few minutes he stopped and looked toward the hallway, listening, waiting. He opened one drawer, checked something, and locked it again. Mercer paused the video. Watch carefully. The timestamp changed October 14th, 1147 p.m. Daniel entered wearing only jeans and a gray sweatshirt. He looked tired, much older than I remembered. He locked the office door before sitting directly in front of the camera. For several seconds he simply stared into space. Then he began speaking. If you're watching this, things didn't go the way I hoped. He rubbed both hands across his face. I found enough evidence to know someone has been stealing from Charles. But that's no longer what worries me. My breathing slowed. Daniel leaned closer. I think someone has realized I'm getting close. He opened his notebook. I've started noticing little things. My desk moved. My files rearranged. Someone entered this office while Margaret and I were sleeping. He looked toward the doorway again. If anything happens, don't assume it was an accident. The room around me disappeared. All I could see was Daniel alive talking to me. He took a deep breath. Margaret. His voice softened. If you're watching this, I need you to hear something. I've never been afraid of losing money. I've never been afraid of losing this job. My only fear has been leaving you alone. My eyes filled again. Daniel smiled sadly. You've always believed people deserved another chance. I love that about you. But this time, trust actions, not promises. The recording continued. I don't believe Emily is evil. Those words caught everyone in the room by surprise. Daniel shook his head slowly. No, I think she's scared. I think she's trying to hold together a marriage that's already falling apart. He looked down at his wedding ring. Ryan worries me. I've caught him asking questions he shouldn't be asking. He watches people instead of listening to them. He smiles too quickly. And every conversation somehow ends with money. Charles quietly sighed. Mercer said nothing. Daniel continued speaking. If I'm wrong, I hope this recording embarrasses me. But if I'm right, he looked straight into the camera. Margaret, please don't hate Emily. Help her. She may not even understand what's happening. The recording ended. No one moved. I covered my mouth with both hands. The last thing Daniel had worried about wasn't himself, it wasn't Charles, it wasn't the investigation, it was our daughter. After several minutes, Mercer quietly inserted another file. This wasn't recorded by Daniel. The screen showed a laboratory and a woman wearing a white medical coat appeared. This is Dr. Elaine Porter, Mercer explained. Chief toxicologist. She looked directly into the camera. We reviewed Mr. Collins's hospital records. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. She paused. However, our review identified several inconsistencies. Charles leaned forward. Dr. Porter continued times. The medications recovered from Mr. Collins's home do not match the medication documented by his physician 6 weeks earlier. I frowned. What does that mean? Mercer answered before the video continued. It means the pills found after Daniel died weren't the same pills his doctor prescribed. My heartbeat became painfully loud. Dr. Porter held up 2 nearly identical prescription bottles. Consolidated containers appear identical. The labels match. The dosage appears correct. She placed them side by side, but chemically they are completely different. She pointed toward laboratory photographs. The medication found inside one bottle had been substituted. My throat tightened. Substituted. Mercer nodded. Someone replaced Daniel's heart medication. I stared at him. With what? He answered quietly, a drug that dramatically increases blood pressure. The room became perfectly still. Dr. Porter resumed speaking. For a healthy adult, the medication would likely produce severe discomfort. For a patient with Daniel Collins's cardiac condition, she lowered her eyes. It could easily prove fatal. I felt every bit of strength leave my body. No, the word escaped before I realized I had spoken. No. Charles rolled his wheelchair closer. Margaret. I barely heard him. Daniel hadn't simply suffered bad luck. Someone had turned his own medicine against him. Mercer opened another folder. We traced the prescription. It was picked up legally, signed properly. Everything appeared normal. He slid a receipt toward me until we compared surveillance footage. My hands shook as I reached for the photograph. The pharmacy security image showed someone collecting Daniel's prescription. The face wasn't completely visible beneath a baseball cap, but one detail stood out immediately: the leather jacket, dark brown with a small tear near the left shoulder. I had bought that jacket for Ryan 2 Christmases earlier. Me pulse stopped. No. Mercer spoke gently. We're not ready to accuse anyone. Not yet, but we're getting closer. He removed one final envelope. The pharmacist remembered something. I forced myself to look up. What? He remembered the customer saying. Mercer unfolded a handwritten statement. My father-in-law keeps forgetting his medication. I'll take it to him myself. I closed my eyes. Ryan had said those exact words. I remembered standing beside him in my own kitchen while he laughed and told me Daniel was lucky to have family willing to help. I had thanked him. I had smiled. Mercer slowly closed the file. There is still one problem. We can prove someone collected the medication, we can prove the pills were switched, but we still can't prove who made that decision. He looked directly at me until tonight. I frowned. What happens tonight? Mercer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and walked to the rain-speckled window overlooking the estate grounds. His reflection floated across the glass, his face lined with decades of patience, earned through investigations that had often taken years to complete. We stopped chasing evidence, he finally said. We let the evidence come to us. Charles Whitmore nodded slowly. Daniel once told me that dishonest people rarely stay satisfied with what they've already stolen. They always come back. Mercer turned toward me. And Ryan Harper is drowning. He opened another folder: bank statements, loan notices, past due balances, letters stamped times final notice. He owes private lenders more than $400,000. He has less than 3 weeks before they begin collecting in other ways. I understood what he wasn't saying. Desperate people made reckless decisions. He's running out of time, I whispered. Exactly. Mercer placed a legal pad in front of me, which means he'll take bigger risks if he believes there's more money waiting. Charles looked directly at me. We're going to give him exactly that belief. The plan sounded almost too simple. I would tell Emily that while sorting through Daniel's belongings, I had discovered references to an old private family trust Daniel had never mentioned. Not an inheritance, not hidden cash, a trust, something complicated enough to require lawyers, large enough to spark hope, vague enough to invite questions. If Ryan believes millions are still beyond his reach, Mercer explained, he won't run. He'll stay. And desperate people eventually reveal themselves. I looked at both men. What if Emily gets hurt? Mercer's expression softened. Our goal is to protect her, but we have to know how much she already knows. That answer stayed with me all afternoon. More than once I found myself staring at Daniel's wedding band resting on my finger. He had asked me not to hate our daughter. I intended to honor that promise. The next morning I invited Emily to lunch. She arrived carrying fresh blueberry muffins from the bakery Daniel loved. For a few minutes we talked about ordinary things, the weather, church, my garden. Then I sighed and looked down at my coffee. I found something yesterday. Her eyes lifted immediately. What? I almost didn't mention it. She leaned closer. What did you find? I lowered my voice. One of your father's old legal folders. She waited. It mentioned a family trust. Emily frowned. A trust? I don't really understand it. There wasn't much inside, just some notes and a letter saying the attorney wanted to meet after everything settled. Emily tried to hide her reaction. She failed. Did it say how much? I didn't see a number. Oh, she stirred her coffee too quickly. I suppose lawyers will explain everything. I guess so. I changed the subject. We talked another 20 minutes before leaving. She hugged me goodbye. Exactly 11 minutes later, Mercer called. He took the bait. Who, Ryan? He left work early. He's already contacted 2 financial advisors and 1 bankruptcy attorney. I closed my eyes. He didn't waste any time. No, and that's not all. Mercer's voice became more serious. He also called someone we've been monitoring, the same loan broker tied to organized gambling. Over the next 4 days, the pressure continued building. Ryan suddenly became the perfect son-in-law. He offered to repair my gutters, he insisted on paying for groceries, he even washed my car one Saturday morning. Every kindness felt rehearsed. Every smile carried calculation. Emily looked genuinely relieved by his behavior. I think losing Dad changed him, she told me. I wished she were right. Meanwhile, Mercer kept updating me. Ryan had secretly applied for another loan. He'd promised repayment within 30 days, collateral expected family trust distribution. There was only one problem: the trust didn't exist. 5 days later, Mercer arrived at my house shortly after sunset. He parked 2 streets away, no government vehicle, no marked car, just an aging pickup truck. Inside my living room, he carefully unpacked several small devices from a plain canvas bag. What are those? Insurance. Within 20 minutes, he had hidden tiny cameras inside a smoke detector, a bookshelf clock, and a ceramic vase. Daniel had bought me during our anniversary trip to Vermont. Microphones disappeared beneath the dining room table and inside a floor lamp. Everything looked completely ordinary. If Ryan starts talking, Mercer said we need every word. And if he doesn't, he will. You'd be surprised how confident people become once they believe they've already won. Before leaving, Mercer handed me a small pendant necklace. It isn't jewelry. What is it? Panic transmitter. Press the center, we'll know. You'll have agents nearby. He smiled faintly. Closer than you think. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Emily called the following afternoon. Mom, her voice sounded unusually cheerful. Ryan and I were thinking, why don't we come over tonight? We'll order dinner, maybe go through Dad's paperwork together. Exactly what Mercer had predicted. That sounds nice. At 7 o'clock they arrived carrying pizza and dessert. The evening began pleasantly. We laughed about old family vacations. Emily found a photograph of herself at age 8, missing both front teeth. For nearly an hour I almost forgot everything. Then Ryan casually asked, so did the attorney ever call? I looked up. What attorney? The trust attorney. I pretended to remember. Oh, not yet. He nodded. No hurry, but those things usually have deadlines, I suppose. A few minutes later I stood. I'm going to make coffee. Instead of walking directly into the kitchen, I quietly paused just beyond the doorway. The hidden microphones were still recording. Emily spoke first. I feel terrible asking. Ryan answered immediately. If we don't know what's in that trust, someone else gets there first. It's not about greed, Emily. It's about protecting your mom. Emily didn't reply. Several seconds passed. Then Ryan sighed. You know what Daniel was like. He probably hid millions. Emily's voice sounded uncertain. I don't know. I've never heard Dad mention anything. Exactly, Ryan replied. That's why no one else knows. I stepped back into the dining room carrying 3 empty mugs. Both smiled as though nothing had happened. Later that night after they left, Mercer called. "I've already reviewed the recordings. Anything useful?" "A great deal," he paused. "But not enough. We need him talking freely." Tonight he was still performing. I leaned against the kitchen counter. "So what now?" Mercer answered quietly. "We make him believe the trust becomes available next week. And then we wait." 3 days later I received another phone call. This time it wasn't Mercer. It was Ryan. His voice sounded strained. "Margaret, I need to ask you something." "Of course." "If someone wanted to access Daniel's trust..." He stopped himself. "Would they need your signature?" I pretended to think. "I imagine so." Another silence. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he muttered words he clearly never intended me to hear. "Then we'll have to make her sign." Before I could speak, he realized the phone hadn't disconnected. The line went silent. Then came one final sentence, cold, flat, completely stripped of pretense. "It's the only way." The call ended. Within 30 seconds, my front porch lights flashed twice Mercer's signal. Federal agents had just arrived outside, and for the first time since Daniel's funeral, we knew Ryan was no longer chasing money. He was preparing to commit another crime. The knock came just after sunrise, not loud, not hurried, 3 measured knocks that echoed through the quiet house. When I opened the door, Thomas Mercer stood on the porch beside 2 federal agents dressed in plain clothes. "It's time," he said. I looked past him at the empty street where Daniel had waved goodbye to me hundreds of mornings before driving to Whitmore Estate. I had always believed that street represented an ordinary life. Now it felt like the final stretch before a verdict. The hearing took place 9 days later. Ryan looked confident as he entered the courtroom. He wore an expensive charcoal suit, smiled at several people in the gallery, and even nodded politely in my direction, as though we were simply resolving an unfortunate misunderstanding. Emily followed behind him. She looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes, and her shoulders seemed smaller than I remembered. She sat beside Ryan without taking his hand. That tiny detail gave me hope. The judge entered and the courtroom settled into silence. Ryan's attorney rose first. He argued that Daniel's records proved nothing. According to him, Daniel had become confused during the final months of his life. The notebooks, recordings, and handwritten observations were described as speculation from a grieving man under stress. Then he turned toward me. "Mrs. Collins has understandably struggled since losing her husband. Unfortunately, grief sometimes causes people to see conspiracies where none exist." Ryan lowered his eyes at exactly the right moment. The performance was convincing for anyone who didn't know him. When the attorney finished, the judge looked toward our table. "Mrs. Collins." I stood slowly. "I have no speech to make, Your Honor. I only ask that the court hear every witness before reaching a conclusion." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Mercer testified first. He explained how Daniel had documented years of unauthorized transfers. He described the surveillance, the financial records, and Ryan's growing debts. Ryan's attorney challenged every statement. "You weren't present when those notes were written." "No." "Then you cannot state with certainty what Mr. Collins intended." "I can state what the evidence demonstrates." The questioning continued for nearly an hour. Then came Dr. Elaine Porter. She calmly explained the medication analysis comparing prescription records, laboratory findings, and chemical reports. The medication recovered after Mr. Collins's death was inconsistent with the medication prescribed by his physician. Ryan's attorney tried another approach. "Doctor, can you identify the individual who switched the medication?" "No, so you cannot accuse my client." "I do not accuse anyone. I report scientific findings." The courtroom remained quiet. Facts carried more weight than emotion. Finally, the judge asked whether either side had additional evidence. Ryan's attorney smiled. "No further witnesses." Mercer looked toward me, then toward the courtroom doors. "One more witness, Your Honor." The doors opened. Charles Whitmore entered slowly in his wheelchair. A hush spread through the courtroom. Even people who had never met him recognized the man whose business empire had employed thousands across the state. He raised one hand politely before taking the witness stand. Ryan's confidence faded for the first time. Charles spoke without notes. "For 28 years, Daniel Collins protected my family. He also protected my business. He never asked for recognition. He simply did what was right." Charles reached into a leather briefcase resting beside his chair and removed a sealed evidence binder. 3 days before Daniel died, he delivered this to me. The binder contained copies of every financial ledger Daniel had assembled, every suspicious transfer, every forged authorization, every unexplained payment. Each page had already been authenticated. Charles placed another item on the witness stand, a small digital recorder. I was instructed not to open this unless something happened to Daniel. The judge allowed the recording to be played. Daniel's voice filled the courtroom times. If you're listening to this recording, it means I wasn't able to finish. If anything happens to me, follow the documents, not assumptions. The recording continued with precise explanations of the financial scheme, including dates, account numbers, and names connected to the missing funds. Then the final audio clip began. Unlike the others, this one had been recorded only days before Daniel died. The room fell completely silent. Ryan's own voice came through the speakers. Times, he's getting too close. Another voice answered, though it was impossible to identify Times. What about the trust? There isn't one. So what do we do, Times? Ryan laughed quietly. We make one. Several jurors exchanged glances. The recording continued. If Margaret believes enough of the story, she'll eventually sign whatever I put in front of her. Ryan slowly lowered his head. His attorney whispered something urgently, but neither man looked toward the jury anymore. Mercer then introduced the final exhibit, the recording of Ryan's phone call. Then we'll have to make her sign. It's the only way. There was no argument left, no alternate explanation, only silence. Emily covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling down her face. She turned toward Ryan as though seeing him for the first time. You told me, she whispered. You told me we were protecting Mom. Ryan didn't answer. The judge looked toward the federal agents standing quietly near the rear doors. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds sufficient probable cause for criminal charges related to fraud, financial conspiracy, and the ongoing homicide investigation. The agent stepped forward. Ryan stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. You can't prove. One of the agents calmly placed him in handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. Ryan finally looked at me. There was no apology, only anger. Then he was led away. Emily remained seated, crying silently. I walked over after the courtroom emptied. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked up. I'm sorry, Mom. I should have listened to Dad. I knelt beside her. We can't change yesterday, Emily. But we still have tomorrow. She leaned into my arms and cried the way she hadn't been able to at her father's funeral. Months later, after the criminal case formally concluded, I visited Daniel's grave on a bright autumn afternoon. The maple trees had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. Charles Whitmore joined me carrying a single white lily. He placed it gently beside the headstone. I've spent my life building companies, he said. But Daniel built something far more valuable. I looked at him. What was that? He smiled. Trust. We stood there in comfortable silence. The wind moved softly through the trees, and for the first time since Daniel's death, I didn't feel consumed by questions. Justice had not erased my grief, nothing ever could, but it had restored something I feared was gone forever. Peace.